Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the Slang of Ages podcast. I'm your host, Preston Frazier, and I'm very fortunate to have an extra special guest. I have Kevin Mulryne from the Yes Music podcast, who's going to talk about his wonderful new book, Yes Tormato Story. Kevin, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Preston. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you as well. We've had Mark Anthony Kay on the podcast a few times, and I think Mark was the only guest to talk about a Yes album. We discussed my current favorite Yes album, Drama, but
Mm.
you wrote a book about a Yes album which doesn't have any other books written about it. I think it was Tormato was their ninth album, and it is the end of what you would call what you refer to as the main sequence. Why did you decide to write about Tormato?
It's a very good question, isn't it? It's one of those albums that a lot of Yes fans love, a lot of Yes fans cannot stand it at all, which is a challenge in itself. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to write about it, because very few people have written anything about the album and certainly not delved into the history of it, how it was put together, why it sounds like it does, and all those things. And Tormato was the first progressive rock music I ever heard. So this is a story which those of you who know me will have heard before, but my friend here in Stratford-on-Avon in England lent me a cassette tape on
Mhm.
which he had taped on one side 90125, which had just come out. So this was 1983, and I was 13. So that'll let you know how old I am now. And on the other side was Tormato. And so when I flipped it over, I listened to 90125 first. Very good, very exciting, liked it a lot. Flipped it over, and then there was Tormato, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So yeah, I was from that moment I was bitten by the Yes bug, and from there I delved forward and backwards in time. So Drama, that you've just been talking about, I think Close to the Edge was actually the next album I got,
Mhm.
and then eventually I got all the albums and have kept collecting all the albums up until the present day. So that was my introduction to Yes, my introduction to progressive music, and I had been a classically trained violinist
Mhm.
and singer. So this really provided a link for me between sort of pop music and classical music. There's this thing in the middle called Tormato.
Well, one of the things I love about the Yes Music podcast is that you and Mark Anthony Kay have really um, you've pulled back the layers of every Yes album. And when I first started listening to the Yes Music podcast, and I think you're almost at 600 episodes now, and I probably started listening probably back when there was 300 episodes. I listened to every episode, but there's such a detailed analysis of the album, the band members, or solo work. And Tormato was probably the album that I knew the least about, which is kind of amazing considered Tormato sold really well and had one of the
Mm,
most successful Yes tours in Yes history. One of
mm.
the things I love about your book is that it breaks down a lot of different aspects of Tormato. You talk a lot about, of course, the music and the musicians, but you also talk about some of the more unusual aspects of the album, such as the writing of the album and, of course, the
Yep.
instruments. What do you think
Mm.
is the most significant fact that most people, prog people, don't know about Tormato?
Ah, the most significant fact. Well, that's fascinating. I suppose it would be things like exactly how Chris Squire got that sound, the sort of harmonized bass sound, and I was always fascinated by that. He doesn't use it on every song on Tomato, but he uses it on some pretty important songs.
Mhm.
And it's this amazing phasing, flanging, strange sound that he gets, and he never uses it again. He developed it specifically for Tomato, and by the time you get to Drama, he's gone back to
He's doing
a
something else.
very much more straight ahead type of bass sound. Always wonderful, of course, but I wanted to know exactly how he got that sound for Tormato.
Mhm.
So after speaking to Peter Woolliscroft, who was the tape operator at Advision during the recording of Tormato, um, and he shared some things that he knew about the equipment that Chris Squire used, But then we asked our great friend, whose name has just popped out of my head for a
Miguel
second, which
Falcao?
is Miguel Falcao. Thank you very
Yep.
much, Miguel. Sorry, Miguel. Miguel Falcao, who is an amazing chap. So he created a website called miguelbase.com, where he does pretty much what I've done in this book about Tormato. He delves into every possible different aspect of Chris Squire's playing, his technique, his equipment. So we got Miguel Falcao onto the podcast, and I interviewed him about how Chris Squire achieved this sound for Tormato and precisely what he used. And I put that together with some photographs that Dave Watkinson had taken when he visited Yes in the studio recording the last bits of Tormato at Rack. And he took an amazing photograph of Chris Squire's setup there. And so I showed that to Miguel, and we analyzed exactly what was in that and exactly how he got the sound. So that's just one of the aspects of the construction, the creation of the record that I go into in great depth.
Yeah, when you mentioned the bass sound, and I know Miguel's done an incredible analysis of it, the first thing that comes to my mind is a song on the Silent Wings of Freedom, which I believe is the last song on the original
Yeah.
release. And that is such a powerful performance, not only by Chris Squire and that sound you mentioned, but also by the late Alan White. But there are also some other aspects that you explore in the book. And you talk a lot about the flared, I think they're sonar drums that Alan White uses.
So they're North drums,
North.
and yes, you're right. They were flared, and I refer to them as the flared trousers of the drum world, the 70s drum world, because these are just incredible drums, and drums which, like some of the other instruments actually on Tormato, featured on Tormato, which have completely disappeared now. And we spoke to Chris Kimball, who is an expert on North drums, knows everything there is to know about North drums, and he explained to us the way that they were created. They were fiberglass originally, these drums, and they only had one head. So a traditional drum would have two heads, a top head and a bottom head. But these ones were specifically made to take advantage of the qualities to project the sound of the drum much more in a much more focused way. So normal drums, the sound goes in all directions all at once. The idea of these flared bottomed North drums was that they would project the sound out of the front. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that actually worked particularly well with North drums, and perhaps that's one of the reasons they didn't succeed very, very well. But they certainly looked amazing, and they were perfect for a band like Yes. If you remember that when Alan White's first started using these, it was in the era of Yes shows which had the Martin Dean and Roger Dean
Right.
fiberglass sets. So these incredible sets, and when you've got Alan White inside this sort of Spinal Tap capsule with the drums, which sometimes didn't open famously, didn't it? He got trapped inside at one stage. But when you've got that, then you want your drums to look, remarkable, as well as the stage set looked remarkable. And again, it's a bit like Tormato itself. Some people loved the sound that North drums made, because with that only one head, it's a very dry sound. It's not a very full round sound that you can get out of other drums. Some people love those, and Chris Kimball, of course, has his own set of North drums, and he loves the sound, but a lot of drummers didn't.
Right.
And yeah, so it was fascinating digging into that as well.
Yeah. I think the only other application of the Nord drums that I remember is from Russ Kunkel, who's a drummer out of LA, that he played on the song Running on Empty, plays on the album Running on Empty,
Mm,
and played on that tour. And they have a
mm,
distinctive higher frequency sound than a lot of drums of the time. Um,
mm.
but I would imagine controlling that sound in a studio would be a little bit more difficult. And this was an album,
Yeah.
and you'll have to fact check me here, Kevin. This is an album where I think they started off with Eddie Offord, but he left the project pretty early on. Is that correct?
Well, this was something we wanted to find out from Peter Woollerscroft, and the advantage Peter had, but there were two advantages Peter had. Firstly, he was tape op. He was lowest of the low, really, on the food chain at Advision. So he was looking after the tapes. He physically had his hands on all those master tapes that were created in the recording of Tormato, and he was there every single day of the recording at Advision. And so we specifically asked him, how much did you see Eddie Offord? How often was he in the studio? And in fact, he only turned up once.
Wow.
So Peter Woollerscroft only met him once, and there was a call through from the reception to Peter, and the receptionist said, "There's a guy here at reception, and his name's Eddie, and he's got a crow on his shoulder." and Peter said, "Oh, all right then." And so he went down to reception, and he got Eddie with the crow on his shoulder. And Eddie looked around Advision Studio 1 and saw the guys, and then left. And that was the only time Peter ever saw Eddie. So he wasn't involved in the recording at Advision at all, nor at RAC. And I asked Rick Wakeman if he remembered, because the only thing that Peter said that Eddie might have been involved in was some recording at the rehearsals for Tormato. But excuse me, I asked Rick Wakeman, and he can't remember any recording being done at the rehearsals by anyone, let alone Eddie Offord. So it's a bit of an urban myth, I think, that he was involved initially and then wasn't involved. I don't think he was involved at all.
And there was also another issue with regard to the sound of the guitars that Howe was using versus the sound of the keyboards that Wakeman was using. Excuse me. And Howe was using, I think, a Gibson. He was using a Les Paul or Les Paul Jr.
Yeah, so he used a couple of different Les Pauls. He used a custom Les Paul for some tracks. He also used the Les Paul, which was very heavy and amazing red Les Paul, which was a bit like the Rolls Royce of the Les Paul. It was an astonishing instrument. There are also some photographs of him using the Les Paul with the electronics in the back, but in fact he tried it out and never used it for any recording, Tormato or anything else. So most of the time he was using the Les Paul and a couple of other guitars, but generally that was the problem, was that the Les Paul guitars and then two of Rick Wakeman's keyboards, they were all in the sort of the same sonic space. So it was the birotron and the Polymoog, both of which were quite recent instruments, and both of them had this sort of middling sound and were quite thin, whereas they were intended to be much fuller in sound, but again they weren't, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why Tormato itself, some people will tell you, sounds quite thin in terms of the way it's mixed, because there were these three instruments. So Rick Wakeman had two versus Steve Howe's one guitar, all in the same area of sound, and so he tended to lose, and there was this feeling that they were battling against each other in how they constructed Tormato. So yeah, I can't imagine what the what the situation was like in Advision and RAC with those two going at it, seemingly in opposition to each other.
Yeah, but you did a deep dive with regard to the birotron. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found out about the instrument?
Okay, so I need to credit Chris Dale here for this. Chris is an amazing character, and he has got hold of a wrecked birotron, and he's nursed it back to life, and he's taken it all apart. He's worked on the workings of it and also on the tapes. So the thing about the birotron was that it was supposed to be a much better version of the mellotron. Mellotron is all prog fans will know Mellotron. It's responsible for an awful lot of the sound of many of our favorite prog records, and it's based on great big long loops of tape. So each key that you press down starts off this tape rolling around inside the birotron. And the problem with that is that you've only got a certain length of tape. So the tape plays all the way through and lasts for a maximum of 8 seconds, and then it automatically spools back when you take your finger off the key, and then you can start again. So you can only have chords or single notes which last for 8 seconds, which was a great drawback, of course. So what they did with the birotron was to use 8-track tapes. So the big chunky 8-track tapes which came before the cassette tapes that we know, which have an endless loop. So they have a continuous loop of tape inside them, which means that when you hold a chord down on a birotron, the tape will just continue forever until you take your hand off. So there were no restrictions like that. Also with the mellotron, there were different choirs and orchestras and things that you could select. But the advantage was supposed to be with the birotron that you could literally take the 8-track tapes out of the back of the machine, put different ones in, and therefore you could change very easily. Well, that was a theory. Very easily change the complete sound of the birotron so that you could play something very, very different. And the idea was to have these tapes stocked at music shops around the world, and you could go in and get your next set of library sounds for the birotron, and that never happened. And in fact, it turned out to be so expensive and so difficult to get the components that they needed of the quality that they needed to make the birotrons, because if you imagine a mellotron or a Hammond organ, huge, massive, great things, and the birotron was essentially a desktop instrument,
Right.
very much smaller instrument, and with these cassettes in the back of it, and so everything had to be miniaturized. And at that time, in the mid 1970s, that was a very expensive and very difficult thing to do. So it never got out of the prototype stage, the birotron. But Rick's interest in it was that he thought it was going to be fantastic. He thought it would also make his fortune. So he invested very heavily, as he did in so many enterprises in his career. But he invested in it, and he actually, in 1978, at the time of Tormato, he owned the patent for the birotron. So he was very heavily into it, and he had, I think, according to Chris Dale, he had between 4 and 6 birotrons.
Wow.
And he had the most birotrons of anyone. So if you look at the going for the one tour program, you'll see that it mentions 4 birotrons, which he had on stage with him. I think basically 2 were to play and 2 were backup. On the Tormato tour and the 10 True Summers tour in 1979, he had 2 birotrons, and they were the same 2 birotrons as he used in Advision and Rack for recording the album. So they should have been an amazing instrument, but of course it was so difficult and so costly to produce them. And then just around the corner, 78, if you think about 1980, 1981, you're starting to see digital keyboards coming in, and that just blew the tape-based machines out of the water. They couldn't possibly afford to create them and to put them into production, and so it just all fizzled out. And I asked Rick again about this, and he said yes, absolutely, that was the reason. Digital technology came in the early 80s, and so anything based on tape was just a non-starter. So yeah, but having said that, it does turn up perhaps on Going for the One a little bit, but definitely on Tormato, and I go into the book which particular songs that it does turn up on, and you can listen out for some choirs and those sorts of things from the birotron.
Yeah, it's a huge contrast between 1978 and 1980, because 1980, when drama, you have the Fairlight synthesizers, the synclaviers, you have these polyphonic digital synthesizers, and just 2 years earlier, the state of technology was at a space we were still using tapes, but the sounds are pretty unique, or in Tormato, for the synthesizer. So I guess the elephant in the Yes room is, why isn't there a Steven Wilson remix of Tormato? Because the remixes he's done up to that point were fantastic, and that was the first album. That's the album he did not remix. Well, that and every album after.
Yes. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Again, the urban myth is that the master tapes, and particularly the multi-track tapes
Mhm.
of Tormato have been lost, and I don't think that's the case. And I'm not going to give away all the secrets of the book,
Yes,
but
yes.
we spoke to Brian Cahew, who I called the master of the master tapes, and he did the remastered. He didn't do the remastering, but he was involved in the remastered and expanded versions of both Tormato and Drama. So we
Mhm.
spoke to him, and I had various email conversations with him after we spoke to him on the podcast as well. Oh, and he also put Progeny together, the Progeny set.
Right.
So he's someone who knows everything about Yes master tapes. And his job was to go into the Warner Brother vault and to find not the master tapes, um, the multi-track tapes of the albums that he was working on, but of everything else. So he was the one who was in charge of expanding what you got on those CDs. So anything that was recorded around the time of the album, or Tormato or Drama, he went in and got everything that was usable and releasable,
Mhm.
particularly things that hadn't been released before. And so for Tormato, that's things like um, Money, that song Money, and various other ones. But some of them on the expanded Tormato are actually not from the Tormato sessions at all. They're from the Paris sessions, but
Right,
that's
which never came out.
again something else I have to dig into in the book. But to answer your question, why wasn't it done by Stephen Wilson? I think it was a combination of the fact that he had done the albums he really wanted to, and he's a busy guy. He had done the ones he thought were best to reimagine and to remaster and remix in the way that he does so brilliantly. I don't think he perhaps had. I don't know this for a fact, but I don't think he had a lot of interest in doing Tormato. But it certainly wasn't for the reason that the master tapes were lost. So that's I'll tell you that from the book,
Okay.
that we're pretty sure that the master tapes are not lost, but you can read the whole story in the book. And I
Right.
think it's got a lot more to do with the fact that he doesn't want to. I mean, and I think there's a commercial aspect to it as well. I mean, if you're listening to the Slang of Ages podcast, watching it, then you are someone who would probably buy a remastered copy of Tormato. How many other people would who are not that kind of Yes fan? I don't know. I don't know. There's got to be a real advantage commercially for reimagining Tormato, however much you and I would like to see it done.
Well, I mean, that's an excellent point, Kevin. You're talking about the 5%ers. Um, but
Indeed.
Yes has been a band which has been very good at re-releasing old music. Now we know they're on a
Mm,
streak now when they're doing a lot of new music. The new album's going to come out in a few weeks, and then they've already worked on a
hmm
third album in that sequence. But they've been a band, and you talk about this in your book actually about different versions of even Tormato. Almost every album they've released have had different versions of it. I won't way to
mm,
speculate now, but I wonder why they never decided to re-record it. And I guess that goes to the
mm.
next question, which is, do you see a possibility of this being included in their album series live?
Yeah, well, we asked this question of John Davison, current lead singer, of course, of Yes. We recorded an episode of the podcast with him last week, and that's going to be released in a few days' time. And he had already said on a previous interview that he'd done just a few days previously that the band, and I think by that he really means the, in inverted commas, younger members of the band, so Sherwood and Davison and Shellen, are very keen on doing the whole of Tormato, and they have been discussing it as a band.
Hmm.
Now, Steve is clearly, there's no two ways about it. Steve is definitely in charge of Yes at the moment. He's the elder statesman. He's been there
Right.
much longer than everybody else put together, and what he thinks is what they do. I think basically, and I don't think he's that keen on doing the whole of it. In the same way as when we spoke to Steve on the podcast and we asked him why he didn't play the the start of On the Silent Wings of Freedom,
Mhm.
because on the last tour, because that was a wonderful thing to play on the Silent Wings of Freedom. It was fantastic to hear it again, the first time in many, many, many years. And but it started at the vocals pretty much, just a little bit of introduction and then the vocals. And he was absolutely adamant that he refused to play the first part of On the Silent Wings of Freedom because he said, he didn't remember what he did. When he listened to it, he didn't like what he did on
Oh.
the first part of that. And he wasn't going to sit down and learn a part that he didn't like. So there was no way they were doing the opening. Now, you might think that one of the reasons why he didn't want to do it was because it features the bass guitar, of course.
Yeah.
And Billy Sherwood would have made a wonderful job of Chris Squire's iconic solo bass guitar part at the beginning of that song. I am absolutely sure. But that would have meant that Billy, and they played this song first in the concert, so Billy would have been featured at the beginning of the Yes concert. And I don't think that would have fitted in particularly well.
And the thing
Put
is
it like
that,
that.
well, thank you, Kevin. The thing is that Squire wasn't involved in the writing of the album. That was Anderson and Squire was. It was Anderson and Squire, not Howe. But also,
Hmm.
Billy has done that song when he did, I think, the tribute to Chris. I think he included that
Yeah.
song in that album. And the version that he did with John Davison and Jay Shellen
Yes.
was incredible.
Yes.
So
Yes. Well, that's right.
but
And it would be. But I just don't, Steve's just put his foot down and said, no, I'm not doing that. So, and he may do the same with Tormato. I'm just guessing, but he may do that.
sure.
But, in the future, who knows?
Who knows with the S world. So your book has 7 different parts to it. You do an in-depth review of each of the songs, which I encourage everyone to take a look at as well. But the whole idea around Tormato is explored there. The construction, the songwriting, Kevin, it is a fantastic read. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite song from the album?
Well, this is, I'd have to say On the Silent Wings of Freedom, because it's just archetypal, yes, isn't it? I mean, it's a mini epic. It's not desperately long like some of the other epics, but it's epic in breadth and style. So I think that goes without saying it. That's my favorite. However, I do also like Madrigal, and for some of the reasons that I said right at the beginning of the interview, which is I was a classically trained musician, so I love the strings that are added there, and the French horn solo I think is beautiful. I think it's a beautiful Yes song. I think it's very different actually to pretty much every other Yes song, certainly up to the point of Tormato.
Yeah, the
I
harpsichord.
don't think Yes had ever done a song like that. It's a beautiful, beautiful love song, and I love the words. I love the harmonies, but I love the tune, the melody as well, and really everything about it. So I do love that. And also in the same way, I think Onward is a wonderful song. I got those two messed up there, didn't I? Yeah, I meant to be
French
talking
horn, right?
about Onward there, French horn, etc., and Madrigal as well,
The
because
harpsichord.
Madrigal also has the harpsichord
Right.
and the strings in it as well. Yes.
Yeah. Onward is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous song. And Chris Squire was so in his element in this album, as was actually the entire band. Mine probably is a Silent Wings of Freedom. And probably Don't Kill the Whale. And I know that's a popular's choice. That was a single, but yeah. So Kevin, you can find the album, you can find your book at Burning Shed. And of course, you have a Patreon page for the Yes Music Podcast. And I encourage everyone, if you're a fan of progressive rock, if you're a fan of Yes, check out the Yes Music Podcast and get the book Yes, or Tormato Story. Kevin, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, just that if you go to tormatobook.com, so that's it has its own website, tormatobook.com. There is also this, which I can give you a sneak preview of, which is
Excellent.
which is the color supplement. So the way I've produced the main book is it's in black and white because it's print on demand. Now that means that you will be able to get it from Amazon anywhere around the world, or other online stores, even perhaps physical stores as well, because it's print on demand, and that means it'll never run out either. So you'll certainly be able to get that. But what I couldn't do is to produce a color section of it. So
Oh,
if you go to tormatobook.com, you can order yourself one of these, which is a color supplement to the book. So in here, I've put all the photographs that are in the main book, but in color. So I've got a little map of all the different places that it was recorded in London, and some wonderful archive photography from our friend Dave Watkinson, who went to RAC, and some lovely other photographs that I've sourced as well, and lots of color photographs of the birotron,
yes.
and lots of things, and also Jeremy North's wonderful Wembley photographs of the band, seen for the first time, and a lot of those actually seen for the first time, or seen for the first time in proper quality. So yes, get yourself ordered a copy of that to go with the book when you get the book. There you go.
Well, I highly encourage
Little
that.
advert.
I was a casual Yes fan before I found the Yes Music podcast, and Kevin's turned me into one of those 5% nuts who loves the band. And this book is so incredible, so much detail. It takes you back there. It tells a great story. I can't wait for your next book. I can't wait to get my print copy of this one, Kevin. Great job. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Take care.